Welcome back to Squawk Box. Boeing shares down again this morning as questions continue to swirl around CEO Dennis Muilenburg and the company's flagship 737 MAX. That stock had its worst day in more than 2.5 years, losing almost 7% on Friday. It is down again this morning in the pre-market. And joining us right now for more on all of this is Ron Epstein. He is an analyst at Bank of America. Seth Kaplan is also joining us of Kaplan Research. Good morning to both of you. You're here, so I'm going to start with you.
Sure.
There's a bit of a debate, about what was really even said on Friday about the 737 MAX and what this test pilot was saying, whether they were referring to the plane itself being a problem or whether they were referring to the simulator being a problem. That's some of what we're hearing in terms of the nuance. But does the nuance even matter in this case?
Yeah, I think from an investor perspective, not so much, because it raises uncertainty, right? I mean, there's been a ton of uncertainty around the certification of the airplane, what went on in the background, and it raises that uncertainty, right?
So you have an issue where this information was provided to the government, but not the FAA, in terms of the Department of Justice and others, but not to the FAA. What does the FAA do as a result of this? Do you think they slow down materially?
I think they could. I mean, ultimately, like I think you pointed out, we don't know the exact context of it,
right?
But it could slow down the investigation, and if it does, it could slow down the certification.
And right now, your projection on when this thing is back in the air is when?
Yeah, so Friday morning before all this news came out,
right,
we pushed our projection out to March of 2020.
And prior to that, it had been?
The end of the year. So we pushed it out a quarter, essentially.
And a quarter to you is worth what?
Yeah, so in total, we've got about $17 billion of combined penalties and charges, right? So each month is about $1.5 billion.
Right. Seth, how do you see it in terms of the shift?
Yeah, so the news Friday per se doesn't have to delay the recertification of the aircraft. These are questions about what Boeing knew and when, going back years. Not anything new in terms of the safety of the aircraft as we know it today, but to the extent that this puts more pressure on the FAA to demonstrate its independence, more pressure on the FAA's counterparts around the world, EASA in Europe, for example, to show even more scrutiny than they already would have shown, then yeah, this could indeed delay things. Obviously, impact there not just on Boeing and its short-term liability and all the rest of it, but on its airline partners.
What about the management and leadership of this company? So Dennis Muilenburg, can he survive the situation?
Well, I think you have to look at it from an ESG perspective, right? So when you think about corporate governance,
right,
there's a lot of investors worried about that today. It puts an increased focus on that. And I think that's a question that folks in the street are asking themselves today. What happens to the C-suite in general, right?
But I think the question that I would ask, and I would ask it of the board of Boeing, and I ask it of Dennis Muilenburg himself, is there an argument to be made, Seth, for him to effectively take himself out of this? Meaning, does the dynamic change if there was a different leadership at the top? And if there was different leadership at the top, to the extent you care about continuity, does it make it easier, or it may make it easier with the regulators, but harder on the management? How do you see it?
Yeah, and that's the question. At what point does that balance tip, right? There was a Wall Street Journal report out late last night that talked about how, nobody in senior leadership at the company, at the commercial aircraft division, senior engineers, nobody's lost their job. Now, on one hand, you can imagine how, from a standpoint of getting this all right, you would want the people with the institutional knowledge there. But yeah, at what point are they, more a part of the problem than the solution? With each new revelation, it at least pushes them closer to that tipping point.
Do you buy the argument, by the way, to the extent this has become a problem, part of it is that this comes out, the FAA doesn't know it, the company says, well, we actually did provide it to the government, but our lawyers and others told us we couldn't provide it to the FAA. Do you buy that? Is that a fair and reasonable argument?
Well, I think right now what you have to look at is the Joint Authority Technical Review, the JATR. What they came up with doesn't necessarily agree with what Boeing said over the weekend, right? So,
explain that.
Right. So, over the weekend, so the Joint Technical Review was a group of EASA, the U.S., the Canadians, everybody who's got a major aviation authority, and they reviewed the whole process. And they came out with a report a couple of weeks ago that said this whole MCAS system that's at the root of the problem sort of grew into this sort of monster. Over the weekend, Boeing said, actually, that's not the case. So there's some disagreement now between the Boeing company and the Joint Technical Review, how it reflects back on this is like, well, where does all this fit into it?
You know, just reading the FAA's response, the head of the FAA's response to this over the weekend, he sounded ticked off. He sounded
that letter,
very unhappy that they did not make these documents available to the FAA at the same time they were making them available to the criminal procedures on this. I mean, if that's the case, you already had all the other international regulatory bodies against you. If the FAA turns on you, you've got some serious problems getting it back up in the air.
Sure, I think you have to pay attention to also the pilots, right? You know, SWAPA, the Southwest Pilots Union, came out very, very, very strongly against this, right?
Well, they have a lawsuit. We should probably put in mind they have a lawsuit because they're mad about the lost potential pay that they have going with this.
But they are your largest customer. They're the largest operator of the airplane, and they came out on Friday saying, you know, Boeing was fraudulent and putting the flying public at risk. Now, granted, you got to put it in the context, like you said, but the American Airlines Pilot Union, who doesn't have a lawsuit, they came out almost as strongly.
Right.
Seth, you have been relatively bullish on this company despite all of this. Do you have any different view today?
The question for the long term that I'm looking for here are, you know, when are we going to hear about any new pilot training requirements, right? I mean, all of this that we're talking about today is somehow going to get resolved. It's going to cost a lot of money, but they'll move forward from these questions of you know, when they should have come forward with this information. Boeing until now has continued to say that it doesn't think that pilots are going to need new simulator time to transition from the older 737s to this aircraft. Boeing, of course, has turned out to be overly optimistic about other things. If that changes, and if it turns out that you do need simulator time, and if it turns out that each 737 MAX basically comes with, you know, who knows, millions of dollars, perhaps, of additional pilot training expenses over the life of the aircraft, then that puts downward pressure on pricing for this aircraft for the long term. You know, the thousands of units that Boeing has sold and hopes to continue selling. So, you know, right now, you know, it's a volume question. Airbus is taking orders for its competing product, the A320. Boeing isn't. But if it's a question for the long term, not just of volume, but also of yield, and if this plane just turns out to be worth less to airlines from their perspective, then that's a long-term issue for Boeing.
Okay. Ron, Seth, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's a story that we will continue to have a lot more on throughout the program.